Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first of two lectures for Chapter 12. The PowerPoints are split up, so the lectures will be split up. Plus, it'll make it maybe a little bit more easily digestible than a big hour-long video. If that's not your thing, apologies. Hopefully, I'm not too fast for you guys to listen to at 1.25 or 1.5 speed. So today, on this lecture, we are going to be talking a little bit more about social development, specifically peer relationships and kind of how those grow in children and develop. I think this is really fascinating stuff. Like we've done all year long, we're going to be bringing that together with some talk about brain development and some talk about cognitive abilities. And as you can see right here on this first slide, really we're going to dive right in and talk about social cognition. So go brush up on your chapter 7, on your Piaget, on your information processing, right? Because it's really going to fit into that context. And socialization and peer interactions, especially as we get closer to adolescence, becomes really, really important. It's important for kids throughout life, right? Very early on, even if we are dependent on our parents, and our parents are kind of the environment we spend the most time in. If you go back to Bronfenbrenner and think, right, everything in that first sphere of influence, right, your microsphere, is going to be, those peer interactions that you have all the time. And they're very, very informative. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the cognitive aspect of it in this lecture. And the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about how it's measured, how we kind of define and categorize those relationships, as well as some of the categories we use when talking about research. I think you'll find it interesting, especially because, a lot of this stuff will still, be relevant to the relationships you have now, right? Similar to attachment theory, right? It's easy to put ourselves in there and think about how that fits in our own life, maybe than some other stuff. So real quick here, this first thing about social cognition, just what it is, right? How we think about and understand our social world. It's literally like, how do the cognitive processes work when we are thinking about our social relationships? Again, if we think Piaget, how are our schema organized for not just people, like what relationship do I have with that person, but how do relationships work? And what are the underlying cognitive processes that even allow me to have relationships? If you go back to last chapter, right, we talked about that base script, or those internal models for how we expect our needs to be met. And that falls under this category as well, but we're getting a little bit more granular than that. And so some of these things will make up those, like a secure, unsecure base script. So the biggest thing that happens that allows us to interact with other people cognitively, this cognitive process, and we've talked about it a couple times before this semester, is theory of mind, right? That ability to understand ourselves and as a separate being from others, and think about their mind and understand that they act on their mental states, that they're not just robots that kind of do things at random, or that they don't act based on our own mental states, but that they have their own unique, differentiated perspective on the world that then informs how they behave, right? So this whole idea, if you think about eyewitness testimony, right, and how it's not very reliable, right? Theory of mind allows us to understand that we both saw the same thing, but we feel and remember very differently about it, right? And then I react in one way and you react in another way. And so this develops even within the first year. Studies of infants have shown, and I think we may have talked about this specific example before, but you can see the image on your screen there. Infants have shown when they watch other people act, they understand a little bit intention, right? They understand that, like, this is what you're getting after, which if you don't have even a rudimentary theory of mind, right, you're not putting any of those labels or thinking through those processes of what other people do. You're probably not even paying that much attention to it. So in this example, the infant will watch things that happen in category A, right? Where there's a ball on another side of a barrier that the infant can see, right? They're kind of perpendicular to it. And the person will look and then they'll reach over, right, and grab that ball. And they watch this a couple times. They watch them reach over, maybe not get it, and come back and like, oh, I can't reach because this thing is in the way. So they kind of do both of those to demonstrate to the infant, hey, this barrier is making it hard. It's blocking it in some way, right? Then they take it away and they show the person reach just for the ball and pick it up, to which infants kind of, when we're studying infants, we're looking at their how long and how strongly they attune to a stimulus, because that tells us how interesting it is to them, right? Well, you just reach the ball and grab it after they've seen you reach over the wall. When you take the ball away, they don't pay that much attention because, duh, you got the ball, it was easy. But when the person reaches as if a barrier were there, when there's not one, that's when infants start attending longer, because even, again, within the first year of life, they can look at that and in their brain think, well, that doesn't make any sense. If your goal is to grab the ball, you separate person, right? My theory of mind in activation. Why would you reach over a barrier that's not there? That, like, what's your goal there? It's kind of confusing and novel in that way, right? And interesting to them. So again, it's really important, and that's the basic building block, but it starts to grow even within the first year. So there's several different types of understanding that we are going to go through today. And we'll talk about some of these in more detail, but I just want to run through them real quick, what they are, just define them very quickly. Diverse desires and diverse beliefs are understanding that people want and like different things, and they also believe different things than we do, right? Everybody has their own opinions. They have their own preferences. If you hear a little kid talk about something like, that show's for babies, not for me. It's okay for babies. They like that thing, but I don't like it because I'm not a baby. Understanding that things are different, right? Or that you believe something different than something else. Like, I think this and you think that, and that's okay. That's different. We have different understandings, right? Theory of mind is understanding diverse mental states among separate entities. Knowledge access and false belief kind of go hand in hand. And this is the idea that people who see something, they know about it, they have that knowledge. If they weren't there when it happened, they don't know about it, right? So little kid might ask mommy and daddy about something that happened at school that they haven't yet developed this idea that you weren't there, you don't know about it. And false belief goes with that, right? That, okay, because we don't know information, we're going to act on that information we do have, which might be wrong because our knowledge is wrong, right? So you're connecting, right, that person's actions with their mental state, right? More diverse and complex theory of mind. And then hidden emotion and sarcasm kind of going with it, or this idea that how we act is not always the same thing as our internal mental state. I might smile when I'm sad. I might act angry about something even though I'm not really angry, but most often it's that, I'm saying I'm fine when I'm not really. Okay. So again, understanding this is, key to any successful relationship, right? Because, people don't always say what they feel and what they want. I know I'm guilty of that, right? And so being able to understand that and be able to pull that out of someone, if you care to know what's going on with them, is important. And sarcasm grows out of that, right? Because sarcasm is humor where you just say the opposite of what you actually mean. And that's where the funny part of it comes from, if you're a person who likes sarcasm. So that's kind of these growth levels of the theory of mind that happen. They're the building blocks of social interaction, right? Because again, if I understand that you have a different mental state than I am, you have different desires and beliefs and knowledge, that gives us something to talk about, right? We're trying to find an equilibrium there. And then of course, being able to read your emotions, kind of like we talked about in the emotional development chapter, where the more I understand about my own emotions and I can apply those to you and understand that they're different, okay, here's right where the work gets done in a relationship. So we're going to talk about false belief first a little bit more in detail. The way that we measure and we understand when kids learn this is this experimental task where they have to predict what someone else knows. So they watch an object being hidden by an experimenter, and then a second person comes in, or they're watching it, right? And that second person leaves, the experimenter moves the object, and then they ask where the person's going to look for it. So for example, right, two people are in the room, the experimenter hides it, puts a doll in the toy box, right? That's person A. Person B leaves, and then person A takes the dolly and moves it to the refrigerator. And then everyone leaves, and the kid says, when the person B comes back, where's person B gonna look to try to find this dolly? A kid who has not developed a complex and sophisticated enough theory of mind will say they're gonna look in the fridge because they don't understand, since they weren't present, they don't have the same knowledge as everybody does. Once they're able to understand those false beliefs, they say, hey, yeah, they don't know that information. And because of that, their behavior will change, right? So then they're going to say, yeah, that person will go look in the toy box because they think it's still there. So this is younger children, right? They can do it as early as 2. It tends to be better when it's a nonverbal task, but they demonstrate the understanding of it. And that ties in with our language, right? We talked about this with academic achievement testing and in the language chapter, that young kids, we have to look for ways other than verbal ability. And as our verbal ability increases, right, our ability to explain what we do changes. And along with that, some more complex understanding. But a lot of times we have that understanding before we can express it. Remember, we have a lot more receptive language and understanding than we typically have expressive language. So being able to put a complex thing in the words doesn't mean we're not able to do it. So again, children as young as 2 are able to understand, you know something that I don't, you missed it, right? And that's when they start to get excited, right, about telling you about their day, because they know you don't know that yet. And they're going to tell you what they're proud of or what was bad that made them, was upsetting for them. And it's pretty interesting. You see how socially, right, that makes sense. I want to tell you something that I know you don't know. If I think you know it already, there's no point to tell you and engage in that communication. And so this ability for theory of mind, right, it's affected by our experiences, right? And so kids that have siblings, kids that have parents, multiple parents that they're with, they tend to develop it sooner because it comes with practice, right? You kind of come face to face with this, especially if you have an older sibling who's not quite old enough to know to go easy on you, because you don't know that, although most older siblings do, right? Like, they're going to tell you how it is and that you're wrong. And you're going to be exposed and again, thinking Bandura and any social learning theories, right? I mean, yeah, Piaget, these internal cognitive processes are developing, but our environment's going to shape that as well. So if I have more ability to do that, that's going to happen. Same age peers, not as much, right? Because they're developing it on the same level as this. And like all these things, it slightly differs based on culture. But what's interesting is theory of mind, again, like a lot of the other stuff, happens at the same time. It's kind of just what way does it develop depending on your culture. So we've kind of been operating all semester on this individualistic versus collectivistic paradigm. And individualistic cultures tend to develop the understanding of different opinions first, right? What is unique to me that I believe versus what somebody else believes. Whereas collectivistic tend to understand the differing knowledge first because, one, they tend to have more examples and more older people to interact with because of the structures of their families and how they spend their time. But also, it tends to be because that's a more important part of that culture. Like, I am older and therefore wiser, right? So I'm going to share my knowledge with you rather than let you discover it on your own. Both good, both important values, just maybe one's a little bit more higher in priority than the other, right? And so it makes sense where it varies across culture, which again, I think is fascinating, not just how our culture affects our abilities, because we all kind of get to the same place, but the fact that we do, despite our cultures, we're all going to get to the same place and should have the same abilities, right? Okay, so some more just theory of mind type stuff that we get into. This recursive thinking, about 7 years old. So we've built the ability to understand that people know different things and they act on those beliefs. So recursive thinking is this idea of thinking about one's own thinking, right? Or maybe might be called metacognition, although metacognition really kind of gets into thinking about my overall mental state, as we talked about in emotions. But this is something about like bluffing in poker, right? Where I'm able to understand, you can look at this little diagram down here at the bottom, right? I can think about me and you. I can think about myself, right? So that's the guy in the second. He's thinking myself. I can think about myself thinking about my thinking, right? So that might be an example of, we'll get to the bluffing in a second. That might be an example of, this always makes me mad when this happens. But why does that make me mad? So you're thinking about my own thinking in response to a stimulus that isn't there, right? Think Piaget, right? It's not, we're getting a little bit, we're edging out of that concrete stuff. We know when it happens, and now we're starting to be able to think hypothetically as we get a little bit older. We're still not quite there. But the bluffing comes in where I'm thinking about what you're thinking about what I'm thinking. So if I'm playing poker and I have crappy cards and I want to convince you that I have awesome cards, I'm going to do things that I think you will interpret, right? So I'm thinking he's watching me and thinking about my mental state. So if I, with my cards, or I'm like, I wince, like probably going to clue into someone that my cards are crap, right? So I might not do those things because I'm thinking about you thinking about me. So I don't give a tell, I don't let you know what kind of cards, or I do it on purpose, right? To mess with you and think I have crappy cards so you'll bet more and I'll reel you in, or make you think I have good cards so that you fold. So maybe I can, beat you that way. So it's that back and forth, right? Thinking about your thinking about me thinking. If you're friends of friends, right? It's they don't know that we know they know we know. And, who trying to keep track of who knows what in a situation in the abstract, right? And when we start to think about other people's thinking as younger than 7, until we get a little bit older, although really adults do this all the time too, but maybe we get better at recognizing it, there's this interesting phenomena called the hostile attribution bias, where we tend to interpret other people's intentions to be hostile rather than benign. This is something that can be a little bit more severe depending on your experiences, right? If you think about, your patterns, your internal schema for relationships, if you're not very securely attached, or maybe you have a fundamental understanding of relationships where they don't work out, you might be more likely to attribute other people's beliefs to a hostile intention. But we don't always do that. We basically don't always give people the benefit of the doubt, right? When they do this, that's something that's hard to do. We have to kind of like think about that and do that consciously, right? In order to do this. Somebody does something to me, do they do it by accident or do they do it on purpose to hurt me? Younger kids tend to assume across the board, for the most part, that it's hostile. So right, it's like she bumped into me, or I see this in my house all the time with the dogs, right? We have 2 Labradoodles. My 3-year-old is in the way. They're in the way all the time. It makes for some collisions, and it's always, Scout knocked me over on purpose. He was a bad dog. I'm like, well, buddy, it was just an accident, and so that's a dog, not a person, but same kind of thing, where it's like, what was the dog's mental state? Was it, I'm going to knock this kid over on purpose because he's annoying and I used to get way more attention before he lived here? Or is it, I'm just a dog and I'm walking and I'm not even paying attention to you, right? The older we get, the better we are understanding these things. Although again, our internal working models of relationships might affect that. Okay, so let's talk about peers now, right? We talked about social cognition, kind of the underlying processes, right? Our theory of mind expands, and this allows us to have more complex interactions. It allows us to kind of get to the abstract level of relationships where they really deepen. what does that actually look like? Well, in infants and toddlers, there's a qualitative difference, right, between interacting with adults and with same age peers. Hinted at this a little bit. If I'm learning by modeling, like watching someone do something, right, and then processing that and, either assimilating that into my current schema or accommodating my schema for this new information, right, I'm going to get a lot more out of that from people that are older than me and do things at a more complex level. Not that I don't get benefit from interacting with my peers, but it kind of moves me along that ladder, right, a little bit better when I'm interacting with adults or older peers, right? But we start in infancy and especially early childhood, to develop our interest in peers as well. So, it's pretty much just maybe mom and dad really, really early on. But if you've ever been around like little kids, a year old, when they watch like toddlers, they're fascinated by them, right? Because they're beginning, right, to develop. They're like, that's like me. It's not an adult. It kind of is. And maybe I could do the things that they're doing, right? And so it's giving them, right, new fuel for thought. So it's really interesting. And so they respond to that, and they show it by babbling and touching and smiling and like following them, right? Infants attuned to novel stimuli. And that imitation that they do becomes mutual imitation. So it's like, I copy something I've seen, and then you copy me, and then we're copying each other, right? And it's this back and forth we have before we're able to talk with complex language or discuss these abstract ideas. And as our language develops, right, we're able to develop more sophisticated play, right? And so they play with other children, but there tends to be, if you've ever heard the term like parallel play, little kids tend to just play next to each other. But as we're able to communicate a little bit more, that unlocks the potential to have some of that like fantasy play or pretend play, like Piaget talks about, right? Where we're imitating, right? We're imitating roles that we've seen, but we're doing it in a play setting. And we'll talk a little bit more about play later on in the chapter. But it's not that there are interactions before that are not meaningful, but they take on a new complex level, right? And they can maybe make rudimentary games and things like this, right? And we've talked, I know, about the idea of possessing something is an important part of developing the self. Well, once I understand that you have your own separate self, we both want the same thing, right? Those first conflicts that tend to be over, that's my toy, you took that from me, or it was my turn, not your turn, right? That's, again, practicing this idea of we have differing ideas and differing mental states. How will we resolve that through each other? And, when you're a little kid, it might be hitting or screaming or snatching it from you or running to get mommy and daddy, but eventually you learn to work it out. Again, as language develops, when we talked about an emotion, more complex and detailed language we have, the better able we can communicate our mental states to each other so that we can hash it out without violence or strong emotions or antisocial behavior, right? And so all these things kind of go into that reciprocal nature. And then this, right? This is how your relationships, that constant interaction shapes and forms the relationship. At young ages, we're also practicing skills. We probably still are older, but more refining and maybe getting better at ones we probably already have, right? Friendship tends to be, in preschoolers, right, as we move into the preschool age, tends to be formed based on mutually enjoyed activities. We like to do the same things together. Remember, kids are still very, very egocentric right now. So I'm not going to do something that you want to do because it's fun, because it's nice to do things that the other person thinks is fun every once in a while, right? Like my wife will watch like one episode of Star Trek with me a year because she loves me and she knows it makes me happy, right? Because I love her and know Star Trek makes her unhappy, I limit it to about one a year, right? Little kids don't know that. So if Zach and I are going to have a good time, we are doing what he wants to do 100% of the time, right? And that's another good example of that, interacting with older peers. A same age peer is not going to do something they're not interested in with you. Whereas an adult or a teenager, right, might cater more to your level and you get a little bit more interaction or sustained interaction, right? Because that person's willing to do your boring little kid stuff for as long as you want to do it. And so that fantasy play that kids start to engage in, you be the mommy and I'll be the daddy, or you be the doctor and I'll be the patient, or you're the cop and I'm the robber, however that goes, promotes more sophisticated level of mutual planning, right? Accommodating of others' desires, and allows for the expression of emotion, right? Because think the cops and robbers, right? I'm the policeman and you're running away and I shoot you and say, bang, I shot you, you're dead. And the kid says, nuh-uh, you missed. And then the argument ensues. While maybe at first it seems like that's annoying or that's bad, we shouldn't argue, think about what's really going on, right? My mental state says I hit you. Yours says you didn't. We have differing knowledge and differing beliefs, right? We need to resolve that in order for the game to go on. So not only is there a little bit of this social modeling, how have I seen other people resolve their arguments, I'm also maybe a little bit of behaviorism, right? If I'm a jerk and I never say, oh, you're right, I guess I missed, and give something up so the game can go on, I'm going to end up playing by myself, right? It's really interesting. like rats when we study play, because rats have very similar play patterns to us. One, they play, so that may be news to you. But when bigger and smaller rats play, like older and younger, we have noticed that the older rats will let a smaller rat win the wrestling match a certain percentage of a time, and it tends to end up being around like what keeps you hungry enough to think that you could win, that you want to keep playing, right? Because if I just beat you every time, you're not going to play with me. And then, yeah, cool, I've won, which feels good. But now I have no one to play with because, I'm a big jerk and I never take it easy on you a little bit. Think about this if you're the older or the younger sibling. Do you ever do this, right? Like, you want to play video games with me? Okay, I guess I got to let you win every once in a while. Or put it on an easy level where it's maybe not as much fun for me, but you can actually compete. And so, okay, sure, I'm sacrificing something to get something. That's what kids are learning in this play. That seems pretty simple to us, right? But it's got really, really important things that build those foundations of relationships. And so when we see disruption in kids play and they have a hard time playing with others, or they can't successfully do it, or they get way too upset when it happens, that tends to be a pretty good indicator of problems in their development, something like high stress or anxiety. We've talked, I know before, right, that young kids don't have a full complex range of emotion and certainly don't have the language for it. And so how do you know that a 4 or 5 or 6 year old is experiencing something like depression or high anxiety? Well, they can't tell you. So you watch them when they play with their peers, or even by themselves too, but especially with peers and that interaction there and how that happens. Okay, so if play is so important, right, and it's crucial to understanding what's happening with kids, what exactly is play? And this is really important to remember. This is something that's going to be on your test for the test number 3. There's these important things that we define play with, right? So we can measure it, like we operationalize it, and this is what we do here. Those of you that are interested in school psychology or counseling with kids, I suggest you pay really close attention to this, because this is something that you'll end up doing a lot of. Play has to be done for its own sake. It's not for any outside goal or purpose. Yes, it has a developmental function, right? But, I go to my job. I'm recording these lectures because, it helps you learn and I like it, but also they pay me to do it, right? I have a goal. I'm not just doing it, and putting it up on YouTube for any random person to watch because, some people might do that, but even then it's to get likes or to feel good about it. Play is just done to have fun, right? Just to play, just to do it. And, the older we get, the little bit harder it is for us to do this, right? There might have to be a winner or a loser in whatever we're doing, in which case competition and personal glory might be the motivation. But yeah, just playing for the sake of playing is the first most important way of defining it. Even when it's a situation where we're like imitating adult work, right? If we are playing house, or I'm going to the office. The other day, Zachary was very cute. He's got one of those little Pottery Barn, like kid recliner. It's not really a recliner, but it kind of looks like a recliner that his grandmother bought for him. And, in the section of the bedroom that has become my home office, he wanted to pull it in there. So I brought it into the bedroom. He says, okay, Daddy, put it in my office. So I put it in the office. And then he sat down. He said, computer, please. So I handed him my laptop and opened it. And he started typing on the thing. And I asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm sending an email, which he's heard me say about 100 times over the past 5 weeks. So it was adorable, but right, this is the exact thing, even though it's not with another kid right now. It's, he is exaggerating, right? He's like banging on the things and he's not, sitting there quietly. He's like doing it for a show. And you think about little kids will do it and they'll narrate what they're doing and they'll tell the other person, and it'll be, they'll pick up the doll and they'll be like, shh, it's okay. And again, very exaggerated. They might switch. They'll be like, okay, now you be the mommy and I'll be the daddy, right? Or you go to work and I'll stay home, which doesn't really happen in real life, but that's because we're playing and we're practicing. And there tends to be laughter and it's fun, right? As much as I love you guys, I wouldn't describe answering emails as fun. Maybe rewarding if I'm helping, right? But I don't do that to unwind, right? Whereas pretending to work in the back of daddy's office while he's working might have some fun to it if you're a little kid, right? Or playing house with somebody else. You all know cleaning the kitchen's no fun. Maybe cathartic, maybe allows you some quiet time to relax and tune out your roommates. But most of you don't do it for fun, right? Whereas as a kid, you probably played cleanup all the time, right? This is what we're talking about. It needs to be voluntary and spontaneous. You cannot force somebody to play and have fun. You know this, right? Again, see my earlier example of watching Star Trek with my wife. Try as I might, can't make her like it. Same thing with little kids. Try to force a little kid, even a 9 or 10-year-old, or even a teenager, to try to do something that you think is fun that they don't think is fun. You might get different responses, from crying to heavy sighing and eye rolling, depending on the developmental stage we're in, but you can't be forced to do it. And it kind of needs to be spontaneous, right? You know this. The more structured and planned out the fun is, the less fun it becomes. It doesn't mean, hey, in 2 weeks, we're going to go float the river. But if you go up to float the river and your friend gives you a schedule that's like a waterproof bag of everything you're going to do every single minute, not exactly your idea of a good time. Same thing for a kid. Structure is important, right? And like, hey, it's recess. This is good. And maybe we're even going to play this game. but it's not something that I'm like putting a gun to your head and like, you must do every single step. You got to be able to put your own spin on it, right? For it to be true play. They have to be actively and fully involved in a private reality. So less the example of playing a game, although that can happen if you're playing kickball or something like that, but more the idea of pretend play, because we're talking preschoolers. Some of the examples I've used have been older kids, but if we're talking mostly preschoolers here, right? So it's got to be this private reality, and we've got to be fully engaged in it, right? That's when these kind of cognitive and social processes are happening. Yes, when we get a little bit older and we're playing baseball, there's social stuff going on here. And I kind of use those older examples because it gets us in the right emotional feeling. But, you know, again, a little kid at PE time, they don't play games at PE time, right? They go to the playground and they run around. Preschoolers, right? They don't play structured games because what's important for them now is to be building these private realities and making their own games and kind of figuring out how to play and how we do that. And then it should be fun, right? You're not really playing if you're not having fun, and it's motivating, and, you know, you're not going to keep doing it if it's not fun. So that's play, right? This is, you know, plays a crucial part of developing cognitive abilities and developing social cognition and peer relationships. This is what we have to do to be considered play. So then, you know, like every time we over operationalize something, or seemingly do, right? That's so that we can actually measure and differentiate it. So, you know, yeah, trying to get a preschooler, right? So a 5 or 6 year old to play baseball or soccer, while it's good and it's fun, it's not the same thing, and it can't take the place fully of interacting with your peers spontaneously and on your own, right? Might have something useful, but for our purposes, that's not necessarily play, right? Okay, so what are the different things that happen to preschoolers, you know, because this is mostly when this play is doing this work for us. We continue to play as we get older, but it changes, like I just talked about. You know, we might plan a weekend trip, and yes, there's fun involved, and we don't want that over-structured, but that's not the same thing, right? We can handle a little bit more of that structure because we don't need play in the same way a preschooler does, right? So there's the physical developmental aspect of it. So kind of just developing your motor skills, right? Rhythmic stereotypes, repeated large muscle movement that has no purpose seemingly. Kids spin around. They just jump up and down. They like to jump off of stuff. They like to roll around on the ground. They're practicing moving their muscles. It's fun for them, which is good because that's motivating to let them keep learning how to do that. That's how you get better at running and jumping, you know, is by doing it. And when you're a young kid, you might not have a goal, or like you might not understand or even be interested in like a race. You just want to run. Right? You just want to jump. You just want to roll around and practice those big, large muscle movements, right? Remember, that goes from the core out, how we develop our skills when we're getting to fine motor. So we got to learn how to like handle our body in space, right? That proprioception. Exercise play, right? So that's large muscles in the context of play. So now there's more of those structural rules, right, that are happening, but it's still large muscle movement. And then we have rough and tumble play, which has all the stuff we just talked about, the large muscle movement, but it also is a little bit of brain development. So think about these little kids playing, right? What's going to happen if the bigger one pulls a little too hard or pushes the little kid down and won't let him up? Exactly what happens with the rats, right? Other kid is going to say, forget it, I'm out, this is no fun. Or they're going to cry and they're going to run to mom, and then mom's going to have to break it up, and it's going to be this whole thing, right? Doesn't mean rough and tumble play is bad. It's actually really, really good for kids to kind of horse around, because you learn some physical limitations, like how to play and it not hurt, right? You know, it tends to more be boys than girls, although girls, you know, benefit from this and engage in it too. As we get more socialized, it tends to be appropriate for little boys a little bit longer, just because at some point we start telling little girls, don't get dirty, don't push, be nice. And, you know, little boys are allowed to be monsters for a little bit longer. Maybe that's why, you know, so many men have so many problems. We don't force them to follow the rules early enough, or maybe it's the other way around. We should just let everybody play however they want. I don't know. But this idea of learning how to keep people engaged, what we talked about, that process of giving concessions, starts here, right? Think about also, again, stereotypically dad, right? This is a primary way you're interacting with your parent too. Because again, my 3-year-old just starting to be able to, like, we can play a matching game, right? Or we can be like, let's run there and run back, or let's do whatever. We can do other activities, but his favorite thing to do is to jump off the bed, have me catch him and throw him back on the bed. And then I pretend to catch him, and I go and I belly flop on him and mash him down, and we all laugh, and it's great. And it's just, you know, but I'm in control, right? You're playing with an older person who can kind of set the terms, teach you what to do. I can tell him when it's too hard or he's not being safe, and you learn that, okay? So whether it's peers or it's with someone older than you, that rough and tumble play is a really important part, especially with controlling your physicality, which obviously is going to be important for social development, right? Not hurting people physically that you want to interact with. Emotionally, for young children, a lot of times what we're seeing is they're playing out inner conflicts, right? I don't have the language to label and communicate my emotions, but I can act them out, right? I can smash things together. I can squeeze the pillow. I can throw things around. I can tell you. So even if I'm playing, right, in that, if I start to get frustrated, maybe that comes out in my play. And then you see that and you don't say, hey, what's wrong? Or like, man, you're, but you back off a little bit, right? Or you come up to me and say, hey, that's not nice. Let's play this instead. Like, you make some kind of overture. And so there's that back and forth that doesn't have the let's sit and talk about our feelings level of complexity, but it's still happening. And it's happening in the context of that private reality, right? So I'm kind of, back to Piaget, I'm externalizing this internal process until I understand it and it's complex enough that I can, do it just internally, right? Fantasy play, so all those pretend games we talked about, is linked with more understanding of the emotion of self than others, right? You might even pretend to have an emotion, and then you practice the way you act it out, right? How do my parents resolve their arguments? We'll pretend to have an argument, right? Or I'll come home if I'm playing house and be like, oh, the house is so messy, and you're right, and you go back again, probably playing out what you've talked about. And that's what little kids do often, right? They literally just repeat things they've seen just about verbatim. And it's funny, right? When he's yelling at the dog, it's maybe a little sad if depending on what they're acting out, but they're practicing, right? Those situations don't arise organically for kids, so they construct them in play spontaneously, and maybe it's fun, and we might reverse the roles like we talked about, but that's where it goes on. And so what's cool about this, play therapy, I was talking about counselors and school psychologists. Play therapy is this idea of helping children work through their feelings with the help of a trained adult. And so they can, because it's understood that play is a type of communication. So it's most effective when the parents are involved because you've got that strong emotional relationship, but sometimes it'll just be a clinician, and it tends to be non-directive, meaning that you don't tell the kid what to do. Again, it's not structured, and they're able to be spontaneous. You kind of just comment and you label what's happening. So you might say like, oh, I see you chose to draw a picture, and you draw your mom and dad and they're far apart, whatever. Or you might be like, they might want to make up the rules of all of the games and boss you around a little bit. Well, a small kid can't tell you, I feel like my life's out of control because of whatever's going on, and so I'm going to exert some control by telling you what to do, but you can kind of read into it and infer it, right? So you let them play it out in a safe, structured environment. They can just be themselves and have their feelings, right? And this is based on this theory, everything we've just talked about, how crucial and important play is. And this is where we communicate our emotions. This is where we work through them externally, since we can't do that internally yet. All right. And so socially then, right, we go from emotions to socialization. Research shows links between the amount of play and, their competence in all kinds of other social interactions. Similarly to how attachment might predict peer interactions, which predict romantic relationships, play, right, parent-child play specifically, predicts our competence in social interactions. It makes sense, right? Every other thing we learn, we practice it with mom and dad first, and then we take it out into the world. So by age 3, our success in being able to play with our peers is linked to the development of all kinds of social skills, theory of mind, friendships. Kids that engage in play with other kids more often develop these things sooner, right? This is the stereotype. Apologies to those of you that were homeschooled or that are single children families, like you were an only child. You are I'm sure, fine people now. And maybe you didn't have anything extreme. It doesn't always have to be this extreme thing, but we tend to see maybe they lag behind a little bit, especially if they don't get a lot of it, different social skills. Doesn't mean that they don't ever get there, or that they're horrible kids, right? Or that their parents are terrible people for doing it, because there's give and take in all the situations, right? But it does mean like that's the context where you learn this stuff. It's pretty much the only context you're going to learn that stuff. And so you need to have not just mom and dad, which is important early, but by 3, we really need to be interacting with other kids on a regular basis so we can do all the stuff we just talked about, all that kind of social play, right? To build those skills, right? If I only ever have to do what I want to do, I don't learn how to do what you want to do, right? I mean, at its basic level, there's more complex things than that, but that's the idea, right? Just like in all of our other developmental things, especially socially and emotionally, right? Start with mom and dad to understand ourselves better, and then we're able to take that into other areas. And so how this develops over time, right? There's stages of social play and how we kind of develop in preschoolers, young kids and preschoolers, right? So we start with this idea that we're just doing an unoccupied play. Like we're looking at something, but we're not engaged in play with peers. We might watch what you're doing because it's novel, but we don't really join in at all. Right. And that's onlooker behavior where we're just watching you, right? Before that, it's just we're looking, we're not even engaged with it. It's just like, oh, you're doing that thing and whatever. Like onlookers, like I'm watching and I'm interested, right? I recognize that it's different from something else you might do. And then we play on ourselves, independent. We engage with toys that are different. I play with this and then I play with that, and I might play with this one way and I play with this thing a different way, right? I'm understanding that different things have different uses, and that I might desire to play with one toy differently than I play with another toy. Parallel play, we talked about a little bit. It's where kids will play next to, but not really with each other, right? I'm doing my own thing next to you and I like it and I've moved closer and I move around you, but I don't really interact. It's not reciprocal, right? Associative play is playing with somebody, but there's not a common goal, right? Think about that physical play. We're just running around and being silly, right? And doing crazy stuff and laughing and giggling maybe, but there's not like we haven't put any kind of structure or goal or even imitation of anything on it. We're just little kid playing. And then we grow into that cooperative play, which is a lot of times where playing pretend comes in. We have a common goal. We learn to share. So it's like we are playing. It doesn't have to be something like tag, like like I talked about. We're playing mommy and daddy in house. We have a goal, right? Which is to imitate what we see happen. It's not just being silly, right? Or we're building blocks together. We're building a tower, right? How high can it go, right? There's that practice there. We have a common goal we're working towards, and that's what we're talking about. So this is kind of the structure it follows as we develop. And then, if you compare this going back to the different specific domains we talked about, you see how that develops within them, right? If we want to talk just physically, right? It's just me moving on my own. Then eventually I am moving next to you. We're kind of doing the same thing. And then, okay, now we're playing something physical. We wrestle or we play tag or we race each other, right? It's still physical play. It's moving those large muscle groups, but the older we get, the more interactive and reciprocal it becomes. And so by the age of 3, right, most kids show a preference for specific playmates and friendships. We talked about mutual interest, right? That's when you see kids prefer one or the other. Right? At first, prior to 3, playmates are pretty much interchangeable, right? But by the time we're 3, we're forming those first rudimentary relationships, and then we will seek out specific people, which is pretty cool. So again, makes sense with parallel play, right? Because with parallel play, it's that reciprocal interaction. So somebody that we've greased the wheels a little bit, and I find it easy and rewarding to do that. That's what I'm going to seek out. Very behavioristic, right? That I'm being reinforced by the positive experience to seek out a certain person with certain qualities, right? So, as we kind of think about it, we move into cognition, right? And why is this important for learning versus just social stuff? Because we've talked about the social part now. You got to think, instead of thinking about play versus learning, like they're two separate things. It's how it's divided up in school where, you have math class and you have recess and one is playing and one is work. We it's really helpful for preschoolers, young kids, especially, to think about incorporating that learning into play, right? That's where they work those things out. So this idea of discovery learning. So approaches that are catching on and becoming a lot more popular, especially in preschools, but maybe even in some kindergartens. This idea that allows focusing on you to discover at your own pace, understanding without direct involvement of the teacher. There's still some scaffolding going on, right, from Vygotsky, where I'm structuring the activity or I'm watching or I might step in to help if you need it, but I'm kind of letting you process it through yourself, right? Make it fun, do it your own way. And it's more than just literacy that we're doing that, right? Or math or something. This is also those social interactions that we are talking about. It is, verbal skills, right? If the teacher's doing everything for me and talking everything, I don't ever have to ask my friend for help, or can you pass that, or can you move please so I can have space to do what I'm going to do, right? I'm learning shapes or something, but I'm also learning how to interact with other people, right? It's super helpful. So it's more than just the concrete things that are happening, right? It's also all those minute social interactions that go with anything you're doing. I mean, think about group projects now, right? How much complex social interaction stuff that goes into that has nothing to do with the topic at hand necessarily to make a successful group project happen. You learned that stuff back in kindergarten when your teacher was letting you just kind of do a mildly structured activity where you might have to interact with other people. All right. Piaget, of course, like he likes to do, broke it down into specific, a little more granular levels of play and some specific stages that they move to. So for him, it was practice play. So repetitive motor behavior for the mere pleasure of it. This is the sensory motor stage. So going back to those other stages of play, right? This is the non-directed, goal-less, just moving around, okay? Constructive play becomes making or building something for the purpose. So as we move into the pre-concrete, right? Not the concrete operational stage, but for Piaget, we are doing something where, I'm making the tower, I'm building the circle, I'm coloring on a piece of paper and putting the colors that I want onto, right? I have a specific purpose for this. It's maybe not multifaceted and complex, but it is, it definitely has a goal or some structure to it. All right. Then symbolic and sociodramatic play, when I'm able to understand the symbols, right? Think Piaget. When I know fantasy is not reality and I can say this thing stands for this thing, I can use a symbolic representation in my imagination. It's the end of sensory motor. It's the beginning of pre-operational. So, right, my stick is a sword or a gun, or, this little thing is my baby, or this is a car that I'm sitting in, or this is a phone, or what, what I mean? We're playing, we're still imitating, but we're substituting items, right? Where it's a little bit more imaginative than it is just, climate on crap, right? And then games the rules. That's where it comes eventually, right? Making up rules or following set ones. Fantasy play still continues, but now we're adding rules onto it. So yes, it's things like tag and hide and seek, right? As we move into the concrete operational stage, we're able to understand that there are rules. But we're also then playing pretend, and it's like, no, you broke the rules of the pretend, right? So now we got to have a discussion about this. No, you can't do that because you're the robber, or you're the daddy, or you're the whatever, right? You're the lion. You're not supposed to be talking. We're playing zoo, and animals don't talk, so quit talking, right? We're still playing pretend. We've put some structure and some shape and some rules to it. And so you could see, right, these all basically follow the same pattern, right? Which is that we are learning, we're developing these pre-social skills through our play and our interaction with people. Basically, practice makes perfect, right? And as our cognitive development goes, so does our ability to add in more complex layers to our play and develop those skills that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. They're going to be about, real social interaction and friendships and significant long-term relationships. All right. Thanks, everybody. And be sure to check out the second lecture.